unskilled. From 1914 to 1918, it embroiled most of the nations of Europe, Russia, the United States, the Middle East, and the other regions. It ended with the defeat of the Central Powers. But more notably, the war marked the exceptional role of the Indian Army that fought with distinction in the battlefields far away from the home for a cause that had nothing to do with their homeland. Many of the Indian Army were heroes, some recognized but mostly unsung. Their stories of their heroism have been long omitted from the popular histories of the war. Today, we will look at the contribution of our Indian soldiers in World Wars I and II, specifically the battles that were fought by them in different parts of the world, the location, terrain, climate, and the major issues they had to partake during the wars.
Indians in the British Army. British Indian Army. The origin of the British Indian Army goes back to the times of Presidency Army. The Presidency Army was mainly formed to guard the trading station back in 1700. The British Indian Army was main military of the British Indian Empire. It was active from 1858 till 1947. It was responsible for the defense of the British Indian Empire and the princely states. The British Indian Army was one of the major contributors in the world wars. It contributed to the European, Mediterranean and the Middle East in large numbers during the World War I. Over 1 million Indian troops fought in the World War I, of whom many were martyred and many injured.
Who are the sepoys? The men of the British Army were called sepoys. The sepoys of the British Indian Army came from a range of diverse backgrounds. While most of them enrolled in the army for the monthly wages of 11 rupees, the majority of the sepoys expressed a strong sense of personal duty towards the British Crown. They also took the war as a chance to bring honor to their religion and clan on the battlefield. Of all the colonies of the British, German and the French empires, the contribution made by the subjects of the British Raj was the most significant.
The role of women in Indian Army began in 1888 as nurses. They worked long hours to treat wounded soldiers in battlefield. Both the Boer women also made weapons, repaired cycles. Indeed, all to be helpful. Women also allowed to fight in war from 1942 as the second officer Kalyani said, first to work while in naval service.
I'm going to talk about Indian Expeditionary Force, divisions of World War I. India has made a huge contribution to Britain war efforts. It sent staggering numbers of volunteers to fight and die on behalf of the Allied forces. Almost 1.5 million Muslims, Sikh and Hindu men from the region, such as Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Bihar, volunteered in India Expeditionary Force, which saw fightings on Western Front in East Africa, Mesopotamia, Egypt, in Gallipoli. The Indian Army was formed and dispatched several expeditionary forces
Expeditionary Force overseas during the World War I, namely Indian Expeditionary Force or IFA Western Front, IFD and Sea East Campaign, IFD Mesopotamian Campaign, IFE Sinai and Palestine Campaign, and Battle of Megiddo, IFF First Swiss Offensive, IFG Gallipoli Campaign.
Let's now look into the details of the Western Front of the World War I, such as the expeditionary force involved from India and the location they fought, namely Ypres, Neuve-Chapelle, etc.
The Western Front was the main theatre of war during the World War I. The main locations were Belgium, northeastern France, Alsace-Lorraine, Luxembourg, Western Germany. Following the outbreak of war in August 1914, the German army opened the Western Front by invading Luxembourg, Belgium, then gaining military control of important industrial regions, France. The tide of the advance was dramatically turned with the Battle of the Marne and many like Ypres, Neuve-Chapelle, etc. The central powers involved were the French Republic, the United Kingdom, Kingdom of Belgium, and the United States, with limited involvement of countries like Portugal, Russia, Italy, and CM versus German Empire for the central power, with limited involvement of Austria-Hungary.
Let us now look into the details of location and terrain in Ypres. The Ypres salient around the Ypres in Belgium was the scene of several battles and an extremely important part of the Western Front during the First World War. The advantages of the race on the ground on the naturally occurring spur becomes clear when visiting these battlefields. It is not only the crucial advantage of the view across the enemy's positions on the rare areas, but also the daily life of the soldiers is greatly affected by the better drainage of the position located on the higher ground. The area of Belgian Flanders around the Ypres is generally low-lying, and it consists of heavy, waterlogged, clay-based soil and has a damp coastal climate and is prone to flooding.
The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, March 1915, took place in the First World War in the Artois region of northern France. In the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the soldiers not only fought their enemies and their strategies, but also the horrifying weather, which turned out to be a bad winter at that time. The battles fought in 1914 were classified as encounter battles, defined as a series of actions which are unforeseen, where local commanders on the ground had to react. By the end of 1914, the war of movement had transcended into a stalemate, where opposing sides were entrenched in a line of trenches that would be known as the Western Front. A narrow expanse known as No Man's Land separated these lines, and these trenches were protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and heavy artillery, which meant that the armies would prevent each side from penetrating each side's defenses. To peer above the parapet during the day or to attempt to cross this stretch of ground meant certain death, and the opposing forces were unable to break through into their enemy lines. With their troops frustrated, they were forced to live in the muddy, waterlogged trenches during the harsh cold winter of 1914 and 15. The challenge for generals on both sides in 1915 was how to get their troops out from these trenches across no man's land into enemy trenches and consolidate ground without being mown down by machine guns or obliterated by heavy shell fire.
There are several battles to be named for having taken place in the Western Front, such as Battle of La Bassée, Battle of Somme, battles in Flanders, Battle of Bazetin, Battle of Flers-Courcelette, Hindenburg Line, Battle of Cambrai, etc. Now let's discuss the location and terrain of Somme, Flanders in particular. The Somme Flanders lowland was not only of great strategic importance but was also associated in Britain and its empire with some of the costliest battles of the war. Battlefield terrain played an important part in determining the character and outcome of these many engagements. The Somme region consists of a rolling chalk upland while Flanders is a clay plain composed of Paleogene clays with occasional sand units. Within both of these areas, the occurrence of low 150-meter hills and ridges provided the focus for many of the most famous attritional battles of the Western Front, as each side fought to gain strategic advantage provided by the high ground. Despite a range of historical studies documenting the impact of geology on trench construction, water supply, tunneling, and the availability of aggregates, few have considered terrain as a whole in influencing the outcome of battles in the Somme-Flanders area.
The British saw colonial troops as a crucial support, but also had fears about them. Yes, in the Dutch Texas War, Indian troops posed a peculiar problem that threatened the British. And what was that? The rising of 1857 had left a permanent fear of mutiny, and European conditions would be hard for Indian troops. Hindus had fears of losing caste by travelling overseas, while Muslims were unwilling to fight their fellow Muslims in the Turkish army. Apart from the fears mentioned above, the real problem involved meat. Yes, the British knew how the rising was partly triggered by beef and poor grease on cartridges, and the last thing they wanted was to make such a mistake again. So not only was bully beef kept far from the Indians, they arranged for mutton and chapatis.
Now let's have an insight of the battles fought in the Western Front during World War I. Battle of Ypres, Battle of New Chapel, Battle of La Bassée, Battle of Somme, Battle of Flanders, Battle of Bazentin, Battle of Les Courcelette, Battle of Ombrai.
Let's now look into the details of the East African campaign of the World War I, such as the expeditionary force involved from India and the battles and locations they fought, namely the Battle of Tanga.
Now, let's look into the Indian Expeditionary Force B. In 1914, the governor of British East Africa requested assistance to deal with the German forces in German East Africa, and the problem was handed to the Indian office, which assembled two forces and shipped them to his aid. Indian Expeditionary Force B, which consisted of the 27th Bangalore Brigade from the 9th Secunderabad Division and the Imperial Service Infantry Brigade, a pioneer battalion, a mountain artillery battery, and engineers were sent to Tanganyika with the task of invading German East Africa. The force under the command of Major General Arthur Atkin landed at Tanga on 2nd to 3rd November 1914. In the following Battle of Tanga, Atkin's 9,000 men were badly beaten by the 1,000 men under their German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. The force re-embarked on 5th November 1914, having suffered 4,240 casualties and the loss of several hundred rifles, 16 machine guns and 600,000 rounds of ammunition.
The Battle of Tanga is also known as the Battle of Peace, was the unsuccessful attack by the British Indian Expeditionary Force B under Major General A.E. Aiken to capture the German East Africa, the mainland portion present-day Tanzania, during the First World War in concert Invasion Force C near Logindo at the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. Tanga is situated 80 km 50 miles from the border of British East Africa, modern-day Kenya. Tanga is both named most northerly port city of Tanzania, to the west of the Indian Ocean, and the surrounding Tanga region at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro. And as far the climate is concerned, due to close proximity to the equator and the warm Indian Ocean, the city experienced tropical climatical conditions similar to all Tanzanian's coastal cities. The city experienced hot and humid weather during the course of the war, which was not bad for the Indian soldiers when compared to the weather conditions in the Western Front.
Let's now look into the details of the Eastern Front campaign of the World War I, such as the expeditionary force involved from India and the battles and locations they fought, namely the Battle of Kilimanjaro.
Now let's look into the Indian Expeditionary Force C. The Indian Expeditionary Force C was the second force assembled for the service in British East Africa in 1914. This force was formed from the Indian Army 29 Punjabis together with half battalions from the princely state of Jind, Bharatpur, Kapurthala and Rampur, a volunteer 15 Palla artillery battery, 22nd Mountain Battery, a volunteer machine gun battery and a field ambulance. It was planned that the force was to be a defensive one, unlike Force B, and primarily be used to guard the railway to Uganda and to support the King's Rifles in communication protection duties. In the Kilimanjaro area, IFC of 4,000 men in one brigade would advance from British East Africa in 1914 on New Moshi on 3rd November 1914 to the western terminus of the railroad. After capturing Tanga, IFB would rapidly move northwest, join IFC and mop up the remaining German forces. In East Africa, volume of the British official history, Charles Horn describes the event as one of the most notable failures in British military history. Next, my friend Rishika will brief you the location and the terrain where the above Battle of Kilimanjaro took place.
The British conquest of German East Africa was planned as to prompt innovation of German colony at the port town of Tanga and the settlement Longido of slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. The Battle of Kilimanjaro at Longido took place in German East Africa in November 1914. By late October 1914, the British India Expeditionary Force C gathered with 4,000 men near the border of British and German East Africa, commanded by Brigadier General G.M. Stewart. The brigade included colonial volunteers who called themselves the East Africa Mountain Rifles. Mount Longido is a mountain in Tanzania. The peak has an elevation of 2,637 meters above sea level. Mount Longido is located in Longido district in Arusha region. In Longido, the summers are short, warm and overcast, and the winters are short, comfortable, dry and partly cold. Over the course of the year, the temperature typically is from 50 degree F to 85 degree F and is rarely below 54 degree F or above 89 degree F.
Now let's have an insight of the battles fought in East African Campaign B and C during the World War I. Colonial Askari Company ready to march in German East Africa. Germans cut through with Königsberg gun. Soldiers of Belgian Congo's forced public pictures in East Africa. Schutztrupp Askaris who were captured in southern German East Africa in late 1917 wait for their food at the prisoners' war camp. Dead Indian soldiers of British force on the beach at Tanga. African porters in British services died in high number from diseases.
Let's now look into the details of the Mesopotamian campaign of the World War I, such as the Expeditionary Force
involved from India and the locations they fought.
Next, let's look into the Indian Expeditionary Force D. The largest Indian army force to serve abroad was the Indian Expeditionary Force D in Mesopotamia, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir John Nixon. The first unit sent in November 1914 was the 6th Division, and they were tasked with guarding British oil installations in and around Barza. The Mesopotamia campaign was a campaign in the Middle Eastern theater of World War I, fought between the Allies represented by the British Empire, troops from Britain, Australia, and the vast majority from British India, against the German Empire and Ottoman Empire.
Next, let's look into the battles fought in the Mesopotamian campaign. Several battles have been fought in the Mesopotamian soil. Here are some of them: Foul Landing, Fall of Basra, Battle of Karna, Battle of Saiba, Battle of Es-Sin, Battle of Ctesiphon, Siege of Kut, attempts to relieve Kut, Battles of Sikh Sad, Battle of the Wadi, Battle of Hana, Battle of Dujela Redot, Second Battle of Kut, Fall of Baghdad, Samarra Offensive, Battle of Ramadi, Action of Khan Baghdadi, Battle of Sarkat.
The locations of Middle East theaters were spread across the countries like Caucasus, Sinai Peninsula, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Iran, Gallipoli, Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, Mesopotamia, Persia.
Now let's have an insight of battles fought in Mesopotamia campaign during World War I. Mesopotamia campaign started at 1914 and ended at 1918. Mesopotamia campaign started because of allies from British and Australia. These are some of the pictures of Mesopotamia campaign. National Army Museum, Mesopotamia campaign. Khurkas, Mesopotamia campaign. Ottoman prisoners captured at Shaiha. British wreck near River Tigris.
Let's now look into the details of the Sinai and Palestine campaign and battles of Megiddo of World War I, such as the expeditionary force involved from India and the location they fought.
Indian Expeditionary Force in Sinai and Palestine Campaign and Battle of Megiddo, 1918. Now let's look into the Indian Expeditionary Force E. Indian Expeditionary Force E consisted of 22nd Lucknow Brigade, sent to Egypt in October 1914. The designation was retained for all the forces sent there. Two Indian Cavalry Divisions, 4th Cavalry Divisions and 5th Cavalry Divisions were transferred from France in 1918 for service in Palestine. They are joined by the 15th Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade, a unit formed by 3 regiments of lancers from the princely states of Mysore, Hyderabad and Jodhpur. The 3rd Lahore Divisions and 7th Meerut Divisions were transferred from Mesopotamia. At the same time, 36 Indian Army battalions were sent to reinforce the British. 10th Irish, 53rd Welsh, 60th London and 7th Divisions were reformed on Indian divisions
lines with one British and three Indian battalions per brigade.
The Sinai and Palestine campaign of the Middle Eastern theatre of World War I was fought by the Arab Revolt and the British Empire against the Ottoman Empire and its Imperial German allies. It started with an Ottoman attempt at raiding the Suez Canal in 1915 and ended with the armistice of Mudros in 1918, leading to the cession of Ottoman Syria. Locations fought were in the Egypt and Levant, including Palestine and Syria. The Battle of Megiddo was fought between 19th and 25th September 1918 on the plain of Sharon as well as on the Esdraelon plain. The belligerents were the British Empire, including the UK, India, and other countries under the British rule, against the Ottoman and German Empire, along with Austria-Hungary.
Yildirim Army Group carts and gun carriages destroyed by EEF aircraft. Map of Megiddo battlefield. The Black Watch behind defences on the coast near Arsuf. Group of Ottoman prisoners. A scene in the dust of Megiddo during the advance on Damascus. A row of dummy horses at a camp in the Jordan Valley. 9th Hodson's Horse in General Chauvel's march.
Let's now look into the details of the first Suez offensive at Egypt of the World War I, such as the expeditionary force involved from India and the locations they fought.
Suez Offensive. Indian Expeditionary Force F consisted of the 10th Indian Division and the 11th Indian Division, both of which were formed in Egypt in 1914 to defend the Suez Canal. Other formations attached were the regular 22nd Lucknow Brigade from the 8th Lucknow Division without their British battalions and an Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade. Although both the divisions were disbanded later, the raid on the Suez Canal, also known as Actions on the Suez Canal, took place between 26 January and 4th February 1915 when a German-led Ottoman army force advanced from southern Palestine to attack the British Empire protected Suez Canal, marking the beginning of the Sinai and Palestine campaign of World War I from 1914 to 1918. Substantial Ottoman forces crossed the Sinai Peninsula, but their attack failed, mainly because of strongly held defense and alert defenders.
Now let's have an insight of the battle fought in First Suez Offensive in Egypt during the World War I. First picture, Indian Army camp on the bank of Suez Canal. Second picture, the camel crops at Beersheba. The third picture, the Ottoman attacked the Suez Canal.
Let us now look into the details of the Gallipoli campaign and the siege of Qingdao of the World War I, such as the expeditionary force involved from India and the locations they fought.
1915 Indian Expeditionary Force G was sent to reinforce the Gallipoli campaign. It consisted of 29th Brigade serving away from its parent 10th Indian Division, consisting of 3 battalions of group cars and 1 of Sikhs. The brigade was dispatched from Egypt and attached to the British 29th Division, which had been decimated in the earlier battles. The Gallipoli campaign is also known as the Dardanelles campaign. The Battle of Gallipoli or the Battle of Canakkale was the campaign of the First World War that took place on the Gallipoli Peninsula from 17 February 1915 to 9 January 1916. The belligerents of the battle were the United Kingdom and French Republic supported by the Russian Empire against the Ottoman Empire, which was supported by German Empire and Austrian-Hungary. In parts of the world, the British and the Commonwealth forces were deployed in the First World War. Gallipoli was remembered by its veterans as one of the worst places to preserve. It was a scene of some of the fiercest fighting of the war. The Allied troops landed there in April 1915 and spent months on the small peninsula of land guarding the Dardanelles Straits in modern-day Turkey. In the military campaign was not achieved, and eventually it was called a halt. The last Allied troops was evacuated in January 1916.
Let's have an insight of the Gallipoli campaign during the World War. Geographical location of the First World War at Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. 29th Indian Brigade of Indian Expeditionary Force G. The observation post at Gallipoli. Gurkha Battalion charging through Gully Ravine. Indian artillery in action. Indian Mule Corps at the war front. Indian soldiers fighting along the trenches. The machine gun post of the 29th Brigade. Casualties on Indian side. Turkish prisoners under guard. Casualties on the side of Turkey.
Soldiers of the 36th were deployed for siege of Tsingtao. The siege of Tsingtao sometimes was the attack on German port of Tsingtao. Now it is also known as Qingdao. In China during World War I by Japan and the United Kingdom. The siege took place between 31st October and 7th November 1914 against Imperial Germany. The siege was the first encounter between the Japanese and German forces, the first Anglo-Japanese operation of the war and the only major land battle in the Asian and Pacific theater. To be specific, Qingdao, Quetzalcoatl Bay and China.
The World War I with regards to the Indian soldiers and their participation. Did it end here? Did the war stop and peace come in? To know this, let us listen to what our friends have to say.
In 1919, the Indian Army could call upon 4,91,000 men, but there was a shortage of experienced officers, most of the officers having been killed or wounded in the war. In 1921, the Indian government started a review of their military requirements with the protection of the northwest frontier and for the internal security. By 1925, the army in India had been reduced to 1,97,000 troops, among which 1,40,000 of them are Indians. The end of World War I did not see the end of fighting for the Indian army. They were involved in the Third Afghan War in 1919 and then the Waziristan campaign in 1919 to 1920 and again in 1920 to 1924. Operations against the Afridis in 1930 to 1931, the Mohammedans in 1933 and again in 1935 and finally just before the outbreak of the World War II operations in Waziristan again in 1936 to 1939. The India Gate in New Delhi, built in 1931, commemorates the Indian soldiers who lost their lives fighting in World War I.
the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Allied leaders stated their desire to build a post-war world that would safeguard itself against future conflicts of such devastating scale. Some hopeful participants had even begun calling World War I the war to end all wars, but the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, would not achieve that lofty goal. Saddled with war guilt, heavy reparation, and denied entrance to the League of Nations, Germany felt tricked into signing the treaty, having believed any peace would be a peace without victory, as put forward by President Wilson in his famous 14th point speech, January 1918. As the years passed, hatred of Versailles Treaty and its authors settled into a smoldering resentment in Germany that would 2 decades later be counted among the causes of World War II.
Before getting into the details of World War II, let us listen to a beautiful song giving respect to our soldiers.
हम फौजी इस देश की धड़कन है, हर दिल का हम प्यार माँ की धड़कन है। हम फौजी इस देश की धड़कन है, हर दिल का हम प्यार माँ की धड़कन है। पूरा करन चले हर वतन साथियों, आप तुम्हारे हवाले हर वतन साथियों, पूरा करन चले हर वतन साथियों, अब तुम्हारे हवाले वतन साथियों। साथियों 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 साथियों। वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम माँ, वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम माँ। अपने ना लो भारत का विश्वास तुम, जीत के लेके दिल में बढ़ो प्यास तुम। अपने खून से लिखो अपना इतिहास तुम, अपने खून से लिखो अपना इतिहास तुम, अपने भारत को अपना नमन साथियों, नमन साथियों। साथियों 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 साथियों। सगमग सगमग सगमगग सगमग सगमग सगमगग, तोम तोम तननन तोम तोम तननन, सगमग सगमग सगमगग सगमग सगमग सगमगग, तोम तोम तननन तोम तोम तननन। अब तुम्हारे हवाले वतन साथियों, साथियों 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 साथियों। वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम वंदे मातरम।
Let us now move on with the details of participation of Indian soldiers in the World War II.
World War II consumed the globe from 1939 to 1945. World War II was fought predominantly in Europe and across the Pacific and Eastern Asia and pitted the Axis powers of Nazi Germany,
Fascist Italy and Japan against the allied nations of Great Britain, France, the United States, and Soviet Union. While Axis enjoyed early success, they were gradually beaten up back with Italy and Germany falling to Allied troops and Japan surrendering after the use of the atomic bomb.
When the Second World War broke out, as many as 2 million men from the Indian subcontinent volunteered to fight in the war. They showed a great sense of duty fighting in various war fronts. Field Marshal Claude Affleck was a British Army commander from 1942 till 1948, serving most of his service in India. He asserted that the British couldn't have come through both wars, World War I and II, if they hadn't had British Indian Army. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill also paid tribute to the unsurpassed bravery of Indian soldiers and officers for her bravery and sacrifices.
At the time of the Second World War, India was controlled by United Kingdom, with the British having hold in India. The British sent soldiers to fight against the Axis powers. The British Indian Army had become largest army in history by 1945, serving in various continents like Africa, Asia and Europe.
Introduction of main World War II theatres. There were three major theatres during World War II. The European theatre split in two fronts. The first one was the Western Front, encompassing Western and Northern Europe. The fighting that took place in this front can be split in three phases. The second one was the Eastern Front, encompassing Eastern Europe, especially the USSR, and can be split in three phases too. The second theatre was the Mediterranean, encompassing South Europe, the Balkans and Italy and Northern Africa. African, and the other theatre was the Pacific Asian theatre, mainland Asia and Middle Eastern theatre.
Let us now look into the details of the European theatre of World War II.
The European theatre of World War II was an area of heavy fighting across Europe, starting with Germany's invasion of Poland on 1st September 1939 and ending with the United States, the United Kingdom and France conquering most of Western Europe, the Soviet Union conquering most of Eastern Europe, and Germany's unconditional surrender on 8 May 1945. That's the Victory in Europe Day. The Allied powers fought in Axis powers on two major fronts, the Eastern Front and the Western Front, as well as in a strategic bombing offensive and in the adjoining Mediterranean and Middle East theatre.
The European theatre split into two fronts. The first one was the Western Front, encompassing the Western and Northern Europe, which consists of the following. Phony War. The Phony War was an 8-month period in the start of World War II, during which there was only one limited military land operation on the Western Front when French troops invaded Germany's Saar district. The invasion of Denmark and Norway. The German invasion of Denmark was the attack by Germany on Denmark during the World War II. The Battle of France. The Battle of France is also known as the Fall of France, was the German invasion of France and the Low Countries during the Second World War. Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was a military campaign of the Second World War in which Royal Air Force and Fleet Air arm of the Royal Navy defended the United Kingdom against large-scale attack by Nazi Germany's Air Force. The Battle of Normandy, Operation Overlord, was a code name for Allied operation that launched the successful invasion of German-occupied Western Europe during the World War II.
The Eastern Front, which consists of the following: Battle of Poland, Operation Fallvis,
The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of World War II. The German invasion began on 1st September 1939, 1 week after the signing of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and Soviet Union, and one day after the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union had approved the pact. Location: Poland, Eastern Germany, and the free city of Danzig, modern-day Danzig. Results: German-Soviet victory, Eastern Front, Italy, Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name of Axis for the Axis invasion of Soviet Union, which started on Sunday, 22nd June 1941. During World War II, the operation put into action Nazi Germany's ideological goal of conquering Western Soviet Union so as to repopulate it with Germans. Location: Central Europe, Northeast Europe, Eastern Europe. Battle of Finland. The Winter War was a war between the Soviet Union and Finland. It began with the Soviet invasion of Finland on 30th November 1939. 3 months after the outbreak of World War II ended 3.5 months later with the Moscow Peace Treaty on 13th March.
When the full history of the Great World War is written, geography will be understood as one of the fundamental causes. When white people migrated into West Central Europe, they found a land divided by mountain ranges and arms of the sea into small geographic provinces. This led to the growth of numerous small countries. Physical geography, by isolating people, leads to national strength and often to international animosity. The war became war of positions. The topographic situation of each town was important. The position of the Chemin des Dames was important because of its elevation. So the positions of Vimy Ridge and the Messines Ridge were fought for most bitterly.
East Uval in the northern France played a part in determining campaign gains. The great strategy of the Marshall Falk in the final trials was laid out with a full knowledge and full appreciation of the importance of geography. The German army was crowded back towards the Ardennes, through which there was but one narrow pass, the Valley of the Meuse. The retreat of such a vast army proved that the charge would be impossible, and when the route of transportation east and west was cut, the situation for the enemy was desperate. The physical features held them on one side, the army of the Allies on the other.
Nazi Germany's military was one of the advanced fighting forces in the world during World War II. However, its meal system was old-fashioned. As the Germans advanced, there was a long line of support vehicles. These include fielding kitchen. These mobile kitchen made almost everything a soldier would have in his daily diet. Example: soup, bread, coffee, etc. The kitchen would be located behind or near the front line. If that was not possible, runners will carry the meals in containers to their units.
Now let us move on to the North African theatre, Libya and Egypt. Let us see what our friends are going to share.
The Battle of the North Africa was a struggle for the control of the Suez Canal and access to the oil from the Middle East and raw materials from Asia. Oil had become the critical commodity due to the mechanization of modern armies. Britain, which was the first nation to field a completely mechanized army, was mainly dependent on the Middle Eastern oil. This canal also provided Britain with a valuable link to her dominions, part of a lifeline that ran through the Mediterranean Sea. Thus, the North African campaign and the naval campaign for the Mediterranean were extensions of each other in very real sense.
The North African campaign of the Second World War took place in North Africa from 10th June 1940 to 13th May 1943. It included campaigns fought in the Libyan and Egyptian deserts, and in Morocco and Algeria as well as Tunisia. Location: Libya, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. During World War II, there was strong support for Italy from Muslim Libyans who enrolled in the Italian army. In September 1940, the Italian invasion of Egypt was launched in Libya. Egypt severed relations with Axis powers soon after the outbreak of World War II, but remained technically neutral until near the end of the war.
During World War II, Algeria along with North Africa were under the controls of Nazi Germany and Vichy France. On November 8, 1942, the Allies launched the first major offensive of the war, codenamed Operation Touch. The Allies retook Monaco along with Algeria, assembling the liberation of North Africa. During World War II, Monaco, then a French protectorate, was controlled by the Vichy France from 1940 to 1942. After the occupation of France, the Tunisian campaign was the series of battles that took place in Tunisia during the North African campaign of the Second World War between Axis and Allied forces of Allies consisted of British Imperial forces, including a Greek contingent with American and French corps.
Topography is fate. North African battlefield is a proof that the soldiers of World War II were forced to endure. Thousands of miles away from home, they were ignorant of land and people. The environment seemed alien and dangerous. Until arriving, the soldiers' understanding of the land was limited to stereotype myth and army field manual. As you can see, the battlefield of North African campaign which took place between June 1940 to May 1943 was particularly inaccessible because of geographical location, political unrest and violence.
Conditions in the desert were very tough. Cold nights and searing daytime temperatures made life uncomfortable for soldiers in forward positions. Shade was hard to find, and makeshift shelters did little to block the sun. Sandstorms were a regular hazard, and dust stirred up by vehicles and shell fire covered everything. Lack of water to drink, let alone to wash or shave, was a constant source of annoyance. So were the flies. Desperate for moisture, they settled on lips or sweaty shirts by the hundreds.
During daylight hours, men struggled to eat as flies formed on their food or dived into their drinks. One immutable result was dysentery, a miserable experience. Mosquitoes were less prevalent but more lethal, for in some areas they carried malaria. Adding to the men's misery were desert sores. Any scratch rapidly became a suppurating mess. Everyone, it seemed, spotted bandages.
Now let us move into the details of the Mediterranean theatre.
The Mediterranean and the Middle East theater was a major theater of operations during the Second World War. The war-sized of the Mediterranean and the Middle East theater saw interconnected naval, land and air companions fought for control of Mediterranean, South Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East and Southern Europe. The fighting in this theater lasted from 10th June 1940 and when Italy entered the war on the side of Germany until 2nd May 1945 when all the Axis power surrendered in Italy. However, the fighting would continue in Greece where British troops had been dispatched to aid the Greek government during the early stages of the Greek Civil War.
The Adriatic campaign of World War II was a minor naval campaign fought during World War II between Greek, Yugoslavian and Italian navies. The Kriegsmarine and the Mediterranean Squadron of the United Kingdom, France and Yugoslav partisan naval forces. The East African campaign was fought in East Africa during the Second World War by allies of World War II, mainly from the British Empire against Italy in its colony of Italian East Africa between June 1940 and November 1941.
The Siege of Malta in the World War II was a military campaign in the Mediterranean theatre. From June 1940 to November 1942, the fight for the control of the strategically important island of British Crown colony of Malta, which pitted the air forces and navies of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany against the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. The Italian campaign of World War II considered the of Allied and Axis operations in and around Italy from 1943 to 1945. The Joint Allied Forces headquarters was operationally responsible for all Allied land forces in the Mediterranean theatre, and it planned to land the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, followed in September by the invasion of the Italian mainland and the campaign in Italy until the surrender of German armed forces in Italy in May 1945.
The Dodecanese campaign of the World War II. It was an attempt by Allied forces to capture the Italian-held island in the Aegean Sea. Following the surrender of Italy in September 1943 and used this base against German-controlled Balkans. The Second Battle of the Alps was a military campaign fought between combined German and Italy forces to re-establish France Republic led by Charles de Gaulle.
War against Japan. On 8 December 1941, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Netherlands declared war on Japan, followed by China and Australia the next day. 4 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, drawing the country into a two-theater war. Combatants. Allies of World War II. Axis powers. Event. Second Sino-Japanese War. World War II countries: Japan, Germany, Germany, Italy versus USA, Canada, UK, Netherlands, China, Australia.
Let us now look into the details of the Anglo-Soviet War.
The invasion took place 2 months after the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union and Soviet Union's subsequent alliance with the United Kingdom. The surprise attack also took place immediately after the Allied victories over the Axis forces in Iraq, France, Syria and Lebanon. The Battle of Stalingrad, December 1941, is the turning point of the war.
The stemming of this last stage of the Great German Offensive was partly due to the effects of the Russian winter, whose sub-zero temperatures were the most severe in several decades. In October and November, a wave of frostbite cases had decimated the ill-clad German troops, for whom provisions of winter clothing had not been done, while the icy cold paralyzed the German mechanized transport, tanks, artillery and aircraft. The Soviets, by contrast, were well clad and tended to fight more effectively in the winter than did the Germans. By this time, the German proselytes had mounted to levels that were unheard of in campaigns against France and Balkans.
Let us now look into the details of the Pacific Theater.
The Pacific War, sometimes called the Asia-Pacific War, was the theater of World War II that was fought in Asia, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean and Oceania. It was geographically the largest theater of the war, including the vast Pacific Theater, the South Pacific Theater, the Southeast Asian Theater, the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Soviet-Japanese War. In the end, the battle was important because it was a major victory for the United States and allowed the United States to begin the process of leapfrogging throughout the South Pacific as they pushed the Japanese force back to their homeland islands. The locations involved in the Pacific Theater are South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean.
World War II, the Pacific Theater. The main combatants of the Pacific Theater were the Allied forces against the Japanese. The Allied forces were the United States, New Zealand, Australia and Canada. The climate of the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater featured a very challenging climate for those who fought through it. Soldiers faced high humidity, blistering heat and dense jungles. Malaria, dehydration and exhaustion would only add to the challenges soldiers would face. Style of warfare in the Pacific. The style of warfare in the Pacific ranged from brutal close-range hand-to-hand combat throughout the dense Pacific jungles to the strategic and technologically advanced naval and air warfare.
Let us now look into the details of the Expeditionary Force in World War II.
The British Expeditionary Force was the name of the British Army in Western Europe during the Second World War. The bulk of the extra money went to Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, but plans were made to re-equip a small number of Army and Territorial Army divisions for service overseas.
The role of Expeditionary Force was field operation in France and the Low Countries. British Expeditionary Force (BEF), the home-based British Army forces that went to northern France at the start of World War I and World War II in order to support France, the left wing of the French army. The BEF originated in the Army Reform of 1908, sponsored by Richard Burdett, later Viscount Haldane.
Let us now look into the details of Dunkirk.
Dunkirk is a small town on the coast of France that was the scene of the massive military campaign during World War II. During the Battle of Dunkirk from May 26 to June 4, 1940, some 338,000 British Expeditionary Force and other Allied troops were evacuated from Dunkirk to England as German forces closed in on them. Dunkirk was a critical turning point in World War II.
The Dunkirk evacuation, code-named Operation Dynamo and also known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, was the evacuation of Allied soldiers during World War II from the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk in the north of France between 26 May and 4 June 1940. The operation commenced after large numbers of Belgian, British and French troops were cut off and surrounded by German troops during the 6-week Battle of France. On June 5, when Dunkirk finally fell to German army and the 40,000 remaining Allied troops surrendered, Hitler celebrated the battle as a great decisive victory.
After the war, thousands of emotional soldiers marched towards the cenotaph in London to mark the victory of the Indian Army. The Indian Gate in New Delhi, built in 1931, commemorates the Indian soldiers who lost their lives fighting the World War I. The Victoria Cross, awarded to 153 members of the British Indian Army and civilians from 1857 to 1947. The Victoria Cross is the highest military decoration awarded for the valors in the presence of the enemy to the members of the army force. Udadat Khan was the first soldier of the British Indian Army who received the Victoria Cross. Here are some soldiers who fought in the World War One. Even after 100 years of war, the sacrifice, strength, and bravery showed by many Indians still remain unknown to the world.
Sacrifice during the World War I and it not only helped the age but also changed the direction of the world politics at large. Alcin Khan of the 50 and Wide Rifle was first to go into the during the World War. He led the troops of the First India Company to enter the British trenches on Western Front in the Belgium on the at night 22nd October 1914. Kasturba Gandhi was during the London in World War I. In 1914 and 1914-15, she worked in India Army Hospital, helping the soldiers who were wounded in the war, France and Belgium.
Now let us listen to another beautiful song by our friends.
ಬೆಂಕಿ ಕಿಡಿಕಾಲೆ ಅಬ್ಬರಿಸಿ ಸಿರಿದು ಏಳುತ್ತಿದೆ ಭಾರತ ಮೂಳೆ ಮೂಳೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹರಿವನೆತ್ತರದಿ ತುಂಬಿ ತುಳುಕುವುದು ಭೂಪಟ
ಬೆಂಕಿ ಕಿಡಿಕೊಳದು ಜ್ವಾಲೆ ಅಬ್ಬರಿಸಿ ಸಿಡಿದು ಹೇಳುತ್ತಿದೆ ಭಾರತ ಮೂಲೆ ಮೂಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹರಿವನೆತ್ತರದಿ ತುಂಬಿ ತುಳುಕುವುದು ಭೂಪಟ
ಬೆಳಕಿನ ಹೊಳಪು
ನಿಮಗಿದ್ದರೆ ಸಾವಿರ ನೆನಪು ನೀವು ಹಿಡಿಬಿಡಿ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ತೋಪು ನಿಮಗಿದ್ದರೆ ಸಾವಿರ ನೆನಪು ನೀವು ಹಿಡಿಬಿಡಿ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ತೋಪು
ಬೆಂಕಿ ಕಿಡಿಕೊರೆದು ಜ್ವಾಲೆಯ ಅಬ್ಬರಿಸಿ ಸಿಡಿದು ಏಳುತ್ತಿದೆ ಭಾರತ ಮೂಲೆ ಮೂಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹರಿವನೆತ್ತರಿದೆ ತುಂಬಿ ತುಳುಕುವುದು ಭೂಪಟ
ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ 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 ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್
ನಮಗಾಗಿ ದುಡಿಬೇಡಿ ಹಗಲು ಇರುಳು ಜೀವದ ಬದಲು ದೇಶವೇ ಮೊದಲು
ದೇಶವೇ ಮೊದಲು ದೇಶವೇ ಮೊದಲು ಎದರಿಸು ಎದರಲ್ಲಿ ನೀವೇ ಸಿಡಿಲು ಸ್ವಾರ್ಥಾನೇ ಇಲ್ಲದ ಮನಸ್ಸೇ ಮುಗಿಲು ಮನಸ್ಸೇ ಮುಗಿಲು ಮನಸ್ಸೇ ಮುಗಿಲು ತನ್ನವರನ್ನ ಕರೆದು ದೇಶಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ದುಡಿದು ತನ್ನವರನ್ನ ಕರೆದು ದೇಶಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ದುಡಿದು
ಕಿಡಿಕಂದರಗಳ ನಡುವೆ ಶಸ್ತ್ರವ ಹಿಡಿದು ಕಿಡಿಕಂದರಗಳ ನಡುವೆ ಶಸ್ತ್ರವ ಹಿಡಿದು
ಹೋರಾಡಿ ಹಸು ನೀಗಿದ ಮಹಾಯೋಧರು ಹೋರಾಡಿ ಹಸು ನೀಗಿದ ಮಹಾಯೋಧರು
ನಮ್ಮ ಯೋಧರು ವೀರ ಯೋಧರು
ನಮ್ಮ ಯೋಧರು ಮಹಾಯೋಧರು ನಮ್ಮ ಯೋಧರು ಮಹಾಯೋಧರು
ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್
ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್
ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್ ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್
What happened after World War II? Did the war stop and peace come? To know this, let us listen to what our friends are going to say.
The World War II ended with the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. On 8th May 1945, the Allies accepted Germany's surrender. The aftermath of the World War II was the beginning of a new era, defined by the decline of all European colonial empires and the simultaneous rise of two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the USA. Allies during the World War II, the USA and the USSR became competitors on the world stage and engaged in the Cold War.
World War II had a profound effect on colonial powers because it completely destroyed their economies. Both Britain and France tried to re-establish their economies but failed due to American intervention. The Suez Canal was nationalized by Egypt in 1956. Both Britain and France convinced US to invade Egypt to regain the canal. The war changed the economical balance, leaving European countries deep in debt and making US the industrial power and creditor in the world.